Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2023 Audit Committee Forum. I'm a new face to most of you. I'm Megan Kirchner, the Assistant Auditor-General for Parliamentary Reports and Services. I'm joined today by two much more familiar faces, our Auditor-General Andrew Greaves and our Assistant Auditor-General for Financial Audit, Roberta Skliros. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise a continuing connection to lands, water and communities. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, to elders past and present, to leaders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people joining us today. Today's event is our first Audit Committee Forum of 2023-24. For these forums, we bring together our Audit Committee chairs and members to explore the latest and emerging public sector trends and insights. Roberta will present on the Auditor-General's report on the state's annual financial report, and Andrew will present on integrity in the Victorian public sector. There will be time for some questions after each presentation, and then we'll hold a Q&A plenary session. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping matters. You can rewind the event while it's on if you arrive late. If you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function, which is the speech bubble icon in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And thank you to those who submitted questions in advance of today's session. We'll cover them in the plenary session. Towards the end of our session today, we'll be sharing a link to a short survey that we hope you'll all fill in before you leave. It will really help us to continue to build and improve this event. Following the event, we'll also provide everyone with links to each of today's presentations. And now we'll get into the main event. We'll get into our presentations. Roberta is going to start us off. So over to you, Roberta.
Thanks, Megan. It's lovely to be with you all today at what I think I counted my 5th Audit Committee Forum since 2020. I'd like to thank you all for continuing to come along to these events to listen to the insights of the Auditor-General, to support you in discharging your really important roles as Audit Committee members, and also taking the time to hear about some of the critical work we do to inform Parliament and the Victorian community. For new members attending today, welcome, and I hope you can take some value away from today's content. I'm using my allocated time this morning to provide you with an overview of the Auditor-General's report on the state's annual financial report for the most recent financial year. And there's nothing quite like something being hot off the press. And this is just that. We tabled our report this morning in Parliament at 9 a.m. And we're really pleased to be able to share our audit results and our analysis of the state's financial outcomes and key emerging risks. I'm aware that some of you within the audience will understand the context of why we undertake the audit of the state's AFR and also provide our subsequent report on it. But I'm also aware that there are a number of new Audit Committee members. So I thought I'd just spend a minute or so at the start of this presentation giving you some context around what the state's annual financial report is and why we undertake a report on it. So the state's annual financial report, or AFR, presents the financial report of the state of Victoria as a whole and of the general government sector. The state of Victoria consists of 3 sectors, those 3 bottom buckets on the slide. And the general government sector is one that includes agencies that are economically dependent on government and provide goods and services at below or no cost, like departments and hospitals. The public non-financial corporation sector includes agencies that provide goods or services pretty much on a cost recovery basis, like a regional water corporation. And then we've got the public financial corporations, and they include agencies that deal with all financial aspects of the state, like your insurance agencies and Treasury Corporation of Victoria. The state's AFR itself is then a consolidation of approximately 280 controlled entities across these sectors. And each year, the government's required to prepare a consolidated financial report, and we're required to audit it and its controlled entity financial reports. So why do we then write a parliamentary report about the state's AFR? To put simply, it's a requirement of our Audit Act. The Auditor-General must provide a report to Parliament annually on the AFR that covers matters that he judges as significant, matters that have arisen from the audits, and matters that either relate to effective and efficient management of public resources or in the keeping of proper accounts and records. And we're required to do this by the 24th of November each year. Our report this year. So this year we issued a clean opinion on the AFR again, meaning that the information in it's reliable and that the Parliament and the Victorian community can use it with confidence. To help us form our opinion on the AFR, we focus our attention on the transactions and balances of 29 state-controlled entities that make up the majority of revenue, expenditure, assets and liabilities of the state. And this year we issued clear audit opinions on the financial reports of 28 of those 29 material entities. We issued a qualified opinion to VicTrack for the 4th consecutive year this year. VicTrack's opinion didn't impact our opinion on the AFR because DTF made a central adjustment to rectify the error when completing the AFR. Our report focuses on the general government sector because that's the sector of government whose financial results make up the most of the state's consolidated results, and also because the government assesses its performance based on that sector's results. The state's budget sets out the government's long-term financial management objectives for the general government sector and the key financial measures and targets to achieve them. This slide details those financial measures and targets and the results for the current year and last year. These measures changed during the pandemic to reflect the government's focus on economic recovery, and they were set to be more qualitative than quantitative at that time to allow for greater flexibility in times of economic and fiscal uncertainty, and they remain unchanged in the current financial year. In our report, we provide an analysis on these key areas, but we also include some additional key financial measures that we believe provide a little bit more insight into the financial outcomes of the state. And that includes things like the general government sector net operating result and some general government sector indebtedness indicators. The net operating result and the net cash result are key measures of financial performance and operating sustainability, and positive results indicate sound financial performance. The general government sector reported a net operating loss this year of $8.8 billion and an operating cash surplus of $4.3 billion. This is the 4th consecutive year of operating losses. The government forecasts that the general government sector will return to a net operating surplus by 2026, however, not before expecting to incur 2 more years of operating losses, which will bring those combined losses to $48.8 billion. And these losses, we know, erode reserves and reduce the state's financial resilience. So for the state to be able to return to that surplus on this graph, significant fiscal disciplines required to manage rising costs and to also deliver various cost-saving initiatives that have been announced in past state budgets. The operating cash surplus of $4.3 billion that I mentioned before was only achieved as the state received proceeds from the Vic Roads Modernisation Joint Arrangement, which is classified as a service concession arrangement. Without these proceeds, the general government sector's operating cash deficit would have been $3.6 billion. Borrowings, debt in the general government sector increased by $24.9 billion during the year to $143.9 billion at 30 June, and they're projected to grow to over $212 billion by 2027. Debt sustainability in the general government sector is one of the government's key priorities as set out in the state budget. The government assesses debt sustainability by applying 2 financial measures: net debt to gross state product and interest expense to revenue. We also consider some other appropriate measures to be gross debt to gross state product, gross debt as a proportion of operating revenue, and interest expense relative to the portfolio of debt that's held by the state. Gross debt to gross state product's an indicator of the size of the state's debt relative to the size of the economy. Gross debt to gross state product has grown from 8.5% to over 26% over the last 7 years, and it's forecast to grow to over 30% by 2027. Gross debt as a proportion of operating revenue is also a really useful measure of looking at fiscal sustainability because it's the ultimate source from where the debt will be repaid. General government sector debt to revenue continued to trend upwards to close to 170% this year, and the state estimates that this will reach nearly 212% by 2027. If debt continues to grow at this pace, it will compound the state's fiscal challenge. So with this context on the state's debt position, it's really important that we highlight now that there is presently no indication of when and how the state plans to pay down existing debt and new planned debt in the future. There are a number of other emerging risks that we've highlighted in our report that require close attention to manage financial sustainability of the state. If these risks are not adequately managed, further additional unplanned debt may occur or announced government priorities will need to change. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on these 4 key areas over the next couple of slides. The first risk we see is the growing cost of servicing debt, so the state's interest rate. The interest cost of the state's debt profile is forecast to double from $4 billion in 2023 to $8 billion by 2027. This presents a significant financial sustainability challenge to government, and this risk is compounded by the rolling over of maturity debt in a high interest rate environment that we're experiencing at the moment. The second significant risk is the financial sustainability of the work cover scheme. The value of WorkSafe's outstanding claims liability has doubled over the last 6 years, as can be seen on this slide. WorkSafe's reported an $11.2 billion premium deficit over the last 5 years, demonstrated by that blue line on the slide. They've also received $1.3 billion over the last 3 years from government to remain financially sustainable. The government has acknowledged that the scheme is not fit for purpose or meeting the needs of those intended. And in May this year, they announced a number of reforms to modernise the scheme and manage the financial challenges. The Work Cover Scheme Modernisation Bill entered Parliament last month and remains yet to pass. Balancing financial sustainability and improving outcomes for injured workers is fundamental to the success of the scheme, and achieving this balance through sound financial management and the legislative reform is a challenge and risk that lies ahead for the state. The third emerging risk we identified is the funding of the state super liability. The government targets to fund the superannuation liability by 2035 by way of annual contributions. Following the Victorian election in 2020, the government determined they'd defer its annual contribution payments by $3 billion from last year to 2027. As a result, the government has to increase its contribution to an average of $2 billion per year from 2027 to 2035 to meet the commitment of fully funding the liability by 2035. This contribution profile may contribute further to the financial pressures of the state. And the final emerging risk we highlight is rising costs. Managing rising infrastructure costs and operating costs continue to be a significant challenge to the government. The general government sector outlaid $16.3 billion on infrastructure assets this year, and we also analysed some major active capital projects this year and noted a cost increase of $10.9 billion since they were first appeared in budget papers. The employee costs, from an operating sense, represent more than 1/3 of the general government sector operating costs and are expected to continue to rise. To achieve its financial objectives, the government will need to ensure that the rate of growth of spending is managed. Otherwise, we're in the space of unplanned debt or the reduction or pausing of announced initiatives that will be required. In our report, we also included the results of some work on the COVID-19 grant programs through our DJ Sir audit. During the pandemic, the government had to respond rapidly to implement large-scale grants program to support impacted businesses. The work in this space, Andrew is going to touch on in his upcoming presentation this morning, so I won't go into the detail of that. We made 6 recommendations to government in relation to the audit of the AFR in our report. 2 of the most critical ones are directed to the Department of Treasury and Finance for them to work with government to outline a debt management strategy, and also now to set some specific targets and precise timing of achieving its financial measures. We included some recommendations for material entities around internal control environments, and also made a recommendation to DJ Sir regarding the work on the COVID grant program. To finish up, I just wanted to point out that we have a dashboard on our website that captures the underlying data of the state's AFR, and it's complementary to this report. The dashboard graphically presents all the underlying information, and the data sets go back quite some time, I think to 2017-18, and it also includes the most recent estimates from the state budget tabled in May this year. So if you're interested in understanding a little bit more about the state's financial outcomes and trends, please jump on our website later today and that will be available. Megan, that sort of brings me to a close around the overview of our report, but I thought I might pause just to see if there were any questions on that content.
Thanks, Roberta. We have had one question from David Anderson, but Andrew has jumped ahead and answered it for us, but I'll just read it out for the rest of the audience.
Thank you.
So David said a short statement to define net operating result and net cash result would be handy. Does a net operating result include depreciation or capital expenditure? And Andrew has said depreciation. There is also a fiscal balance shown at the bottom of the operating statement, which reflects the debt financing requirement. This includes capital spend after depreciation is backed out. So thank you, Andrew, for answering that question for us. Were there any other questions, or we can save them for the plenary because we've got nothing else published at this stage? So I'll now hand over to Andrew. He obviously won't need any introduction from me.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks very much. Yeah, just to round out that question, sorry, we should realise, of course, that not every member of an audit committee has that deep financial literacy, and you bring other skill sets to your audit committee. So apologies for not being clear about what we mean about net operating results, particularly the net operating result from transactions, and then the fiscal balance at the bottom of the statement, which really talks about how much the government needs to borrow each year. And I'm also acutely aware that a lot of the people participating today won't be in state government, they'll be in local government, and they may therefore feel that that presentation was less relevant to them. But of course, you are directly and indirectly impacted by the financial fortunes of the state government in terms of the constraints it's now facing, as Roberta mentioned, in terms of managing rising costs, and therefore the availability of funds to support local government. And of course, we're all being impacted by the work cover situation, where that scheme now is clearly financially not viable, and we're all now experiencing increased premiums. So I thought it was useful for that presentation for both state and local government, because the same messages would apply to local government when you're looking at your own financial sustainability. You obviously want to focus on your net operating result and your net cash result. And while I'm aware local government doesn't do a lot of borrowing, this idea of this fiscal balance, which is where we take the net operating result and back out depreciation and add in capital spend, is also not a bad measure to be looking at. Anyway, it's great to be back. The presentation I think we gave last year was going to be my last year as the Auditor-General. Some of you may be surprised to see me again. I'm a little surprised to see me again as well. But suffice to say, the Parliament, and in particular the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, saw fit to recommend my reappointment as Auditor-General for a 7-year term. I'm appointed under the Constitution Act of Victoria, and it only provides for a 7-year term. So that seems like a long haul at the moment, but I'm pretty excited about the challenges that we're facing. So I look forward to continuing to engage with you all and with all our public sector agencies over this term. Today I was going to ostensibly to talk about the thematics that come out of our annual report on where we follow up on implementation of recommendations by agencies, and I will be true to that, and I will touch on that, and I was going to draw out the general thematics. But a couple of things happened yesterday that caused me to pause and think about what would be the major thematic I wanted to talk about today. And that's why I've chosen very late to retitle my presentation, not as advertised, but to focus the presentation on integrity in the Victorian public sector, or Victorian public service more narrowly. And those two things that happened yesterday, some of you may or may not be aware, but the Victorian Secretaries Board put out a statement on integrity. which is unusual in and of itself. So I thought that we should have a look at that and try to understand and unpack where that's come from and what they're really saying. And of course, overnight, you've had a secretary of a department appear before a parliamentary committee and indicate directly that they were told not to inform their minister about something. So they kind of two flags, if you like, for me to focus my presentation today on integrity. So, integrity, where do I start? I normally start with this slide. And for those of you who've been around for a while, you're probably sick of this slide, but it's my perspective on integrity, and it's framed against the various roles of Auditors-General versus Ombudsman and anti-corruption commissions and the like local government inspectorate. And it's a good framing tool for me because it gives me the opportunity to talk about and define integrity. And a lot of people, when I talk to them about integrity, and quite properly, the first response is, well, integrity is about an absence of corruption. Integrity is about following laws and rules. And I think that's quite appropriate. That's a reasonable response. But I think we've got to, as public servants, I was reading something the other day saying, well, the government doesn't spend its own money, it spends somebody else's money. And as public servants, whether it's in state or local government, we've got to think about integrity in a much wider setting, in a much wider context. And my challenge to you as members of audit committees and to public servants generally is that you can't demonstrate integrity simply by demonstrating there's an absence of corruption, there's an absence of fraud, that you have complied with laws and regulations. You can only really demonstrate integrity if you can also demonstrate that you have delivered public services economically, efficiently and effectively. So I've broadened that construct and that definition of integrity, and I was keen to then look around and see how other people talk about integrity. And I know there's been a lot of work, and we all sat there through the robo-debt inquiry, feeling pretty bad about the public sector, at least at the APS level. And a lot of stuff have come out of that since the inquiry. And I thought this was a nice definition from Steve Sedgwick about what integrity is, and it turns it away from this negative construct of an absence of corruption to actually, as you can read the slide there yourself, doing the right thing at the right time. And the other thing that I'd add to that is that doing things right. So we talk about doing the right thing and doing things right. So this pursuit of standards of professionalism, right, and this idea that we are true to our core values as public servants. So this is some information that the Australian Public Service has put up on their websites. They've got integrity toolkits, and I'd commend them to you through a deep reading of them over the last couple of days. And this is how they define integrity. And the reason I'm labouring this is because I believe fundamentally that an audit committee has a central role in helping to understand and respond to the integrity culture in your organisations. So again, you can read that and you'll have the slide pack later on. So that's kind of framed the conversation I wanted to have with you about the recommendations report that we do each year. So some of you, again, may not be aware of this, but every year now I do an annual status update on all the recommendations we've made in all our performance audits. And there's two things I'm trying to do in that. I'm trying to help, again, the audit committees and agencies manage and monitor their progress in implementing my recommendations. And of course, by making it public, I guess what I'm trying to do is put a bit of external pressure on agencies so that they are held accountable for implementing the audit recommendations that they agree to. And as with most reports that we do these days, it's accompanied by a dashboard. That dashboard's available on the website, and you can see from there that you can filter that dashboard by the audit, by the agency, and by the status as to whether they're complete, in progress, not started. So I find it a quite useful tool when I'm sitting down talking with secretaries and trying to understand how they're responding to audit recommendations. Coming back to this integrity theme, one of the things we look at when we're trying to understand organisational integrity or culture is what we call control consciousness. And a part of control consciousness is the attitude and behaviour of management toward both external audit and internal audit. And one of the signals that we look for is whether or not management does respond to audit recommendations in a timely way. That's a signal to us that they take audit seriously and that they worry about the risks that we identify that relate to the recommendations that they want to get on and actually take action. So I'd commend that dashboard to you. I also think it's a way that you could perhaps emulate within your own organisation. I know some of you have systems where you are tracking recommendations. This is external audit recommendations. It would not be hard to augment this, pardon me, with internal audit recommendations and other recommendations from other sources, so that you as committee members have a comprehensive view of all the recommendations that have been made within your organisation and the status of those. And in fact, that's what we do here in VARGO. We have our own internal dashboard which tracks external audit and internal audit recommendations. I should just mention, I've just said external audit recommendations. Again, some of you may not be as familiar with the external audit regimen that applies to VARGO. Every 4 years we have an external performance audit undertaken on my organisation. That audit is commissioned by and auspiced by and oversighted by the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee. And the last one was 4 years ago. So the fact that I've come back means that I'm now facing my next external audit, and a firm called Martin Jenkins from New Zealand has been appointed. You can look at the terms of reference. They're on the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee website. You'll see that the terms of reference are quite comprehensive and quite detailed in terms of their lines of inquiry. And I mention that in particular because Martin Jenkins, as a part of their external audit of my organisation, and Tom Gott is the partner, have indicated they want to reach out to agencies. I welcome that, and I've encouraged Tom to reach out not just to secretaries, but I've encouraged him to reach out to audit committee chairs and to CFOs. Now, I can't direct what he does, so he may not reach out to you, but I'd certainly encourage it. And I'm sure Tom would take unsolicited representations from anybody as it goes to the terms of reference on the financial audit. So there's an opportunity for you outside of our annual survey that we do of CFOs, and I believe this year we're going to do our biannual survey of audit committee chairs as well through financial audit. Right, so that's the dashboard. That gives you a sense. So what were the thematics, or if you like, where were our recommendations most directed to? So this is in the report. We're trying to add a bit more value in the report. This may give you a sense of, your own internal audit program. And I was having a chat to a newly minted chair of an audit committee the other day, and we were talking about, what's good practice as it goes to audit committees and the relationship with external audit. And one of the topics we touched on was, does the audit committee routinely look at all performance audit reports that are tabled and ask themselves, even though we weren't a part of that audit or a party to that audit, and therefore there were no recommendations directed to us, nonetheless, do any of the findings resonate with my organisation, and are any of the recommendations therefore relevant, and should we be tracking those anyway? And I actually believe that's great. That's good practice. That is absolutely better practice. I would encourage all audit committees to be aware of all the performance audits we've tabled, to at least have somebody do a desktop review of the audit, answer those questions, and if you believe some or all of the recommendations may be pertinent to your own organisation, then at least ask management what they may be doing in that area and maybe get some insights there, or maybe commission an internal audit into that space. We come back to the integrity issue, and we talk about integrity at least being, as a minimum, compliance with legislation and policies and procedural requirements, and yet we make a huge number of recommendations trying to address matters of non-compliance. So that speaks to me that we've got some issues with integrity framed against simply meeting minimum standards. And you can read down the list. Areas that concern me generally as it goes to integrity, because it really inhibits our ability to measure and manage and monitor performance. These issues around performance monitoring, performance evaluation, and an allied issue around record keeping and data quality, data information and collection. We've got a data science embedded into our performance audits these days, and one of the first framing questions we have in any audit is what are the data sets there and how reliable are they? And quite often we find that the data sets, particularly if they're legacy systems, are really not fit for purpose. They're not necessarily reliable, or they don't necessarily provide you the insights, or the reporting doesn't permit, through the legacy system, providing you the insights you need to really understand performance. And that seems to be an ongoing area of concern across a lot of agencies. So if someone's looking for a list of internal audit topics, I think you could frame up some potential internal audits based on potentially the frequency of the findings and recommendations we make in the agencies that we look at. So from that, I want to launch to this, and I mentioned this idea of integrity. And this was the integrity statement, and it only came out yesterday. And it's from the Victorian Secretaries Board, so those of you familiar with state government will understand that the secretaries of all the departments come together as a board and try and manage whole of government risk, and try and manage and understand things like organisational culture. So I think it's a quite powerful thing to have the Victorian Secretaries Board come out and make a statement of integrity. We always talk about tone at the top and leadership. And I guess this is a manifestation of demonstrating leadership. The problem we face is that words themselves don't demonstrate leadership, it's actions. That's quite clear. And so, I mentioned Tim Adder being quite frank yesterday in front of a parliamentary committee and talking about whether or not he'd informed his minister. And that's an area I want to dwell on and talk to you about in the context of what is a role for an audit committee in this space. So you'll find that on the government website. Just type in the 23 integrity statement. There's a link in the slide pack, so you'll be able to click straight through to it. There were two parts of the statement, and this first part kind of mirrors the stuff from Sedgwick and the APS and what the APS has put together in terms of integrity. And of course it ticks all the things you'd expect it to do. Have we got good conflicts of interest procedures? And of course, if you go back to my audit findings and recommendations, particularly around procurement and employment, and you look at IBAC reports and Ombudsman's report, we're not managing and declaring conflicts of interest as well as we could. So there's certainly room to improve in the integrity space in some of these things. The use of public resources, that's my favourite, because it's about efficient, effective and economic use of public resources in the interests of the public, not in self-interest. So that's pretty straightforward, and what the VSB are saying, no doubt, and you'll be saying as an audit committee member, is we need to have this culture of integrity embedded in the way that we operate. And going back to the APS stuff, the institutional arrangements themselves, including, for example, the audit committee, the membership of the committee, who the committee reports to, who internal audit reports to, who the audit committee has access to, all these things are indicia of a strong integrity culture if they're done right, but will speak to a poor integrity culture if there are weaknesses there. But the second part of the statement was all about providing full, frank, fearless and impartial advice. So this is quite the issue du jour, given Tim Adder's evidence yesterday. And more so because the VPSC hasn't been absent in this space, of course, over the last number of years, going back to 2016. But we published a report a few years ago on an IT system implementation in justice, and part of that report identified that information was withheld from ministers in briefing up about the progress on that IT project. And of course, we all went through the Royal Commission into the COVID, and we saw a lot of evidence about ministers not being informed. Now, the VPSC, and of course the parallel here would be, you know, councillors rather than ministers and mayors. The VPSC put out some pretty strong guidance about informing and advising ministers, and they directed the guidance both to secretaries and to people below the secretary in the department who have to deal directly with ministers. The fact that the VSB has now had to come back, you know, 3 or 4 years later and restate this and re-emphasise this tells me that we've got a problem in integrity. And we've got a problem in the provision of full, frank, fearless and impartial advice. So, Roberta mentioned in the report we just did on the results of financial audits of the state, there's an extra chapter in that. There's an extra chapter in that on the COVID-19 business support program, business grant support program, and I'd commend that to you. It's got some lessons in there about what to do when you have to roll out a rapid grants program, and in many respects the department did a great job rolling out an industrial scale grants program in a very short order, and ramping up the number of payments they had to make to businesses. But there are some salutary lessons in that as well, and there were areas where they didn't do as well as they could. And the one I'll highlight for you, and I'll suggest you read, is the stuff about full and frank advice. And we were clearly concerned during that audit that the department was not advising their minister. There was an old inquiry, I think it was into the Erebus crash in the Antarctic, and there was a phrase that came out of the inquiry which was economic with the truth. And when we look at full, frank and fearless advice, full is a key word. You can advise, but if you haven't fully advised, and this is what this case study is about. So where do we go to from here? Well, as I said, I think there's a role for audit committees, and I think they have a broader role in understanding and assessing the integrity culture of the organisation, or at least working with each of your organisations to try to determine how they assess their integrity culture. So I'm now going back to these resources that have been put out at the APS level, and again, here's a metrics resource. And I think it'd be good practice, and I'm going to be doing it in my own organisation. We've actually got a framework that's been developed by the International Organisation of Auditors, but very similar to this, where we do a self-assessment on our integrity maturity. And so I commend that to you. It may be something that you commission or you talk to your agencies about commissioning. And because we all love dashboards, they give an example on that website about how you might set up an integrity dashboard so you can track, you know, these are just examples. I might have a different set of examples, but the idea is, you know, we can always track financial performance and we can track service performance, but are we tracking integrity performance? So again, I think that's something that audit committees could have a useful conversation with their organisations. I'll leave it there because I know you get the most value out of Q&A, I believe. I hope you found that useful, and I'm happy to take any questions that may have arisen from that presentation.
Yes, Andrew, you've had a number of questions arise from that presentation. So we'll just go through them as you talked about the issues. The first one is around debt, and there are a couple of questions about debt. So I'm no economist or accountant, but how will we pay for the increasing debt? And what do you say to people who say that Victoria's debt is out of control and getting worse?
Right. Well, the numbers, out of control is in the eye of the beholder, you know, and those of us who look at this, the economists around the world, when they look at these metrics about debt, you know, and economists love to relate the size of the state debt or the national debt to the size of the economy. And the argument is, as long as the economy is growing faster than the debt, we should have no trouble. Right? And because allied to that, of course, is if the economy is growing faster than the debt, probably the state revenues are growing so that they can manage the debt, the interest by it, and they can manage the repayment of the debt. They can actually service the debt. Now, the numbers that Roberta's shown you and the forward outlook for the next 4 years indicate that the level of debt has grown significantly as a proportion of the economy. And we're now talking of debt levels that are about 160% of revenues. Now, I can remember coming here in 2003 and looking at sustainability at local government. And I think the benchmark we were using at the time was don't let your debt get above 60% of your annual operating revenue. Well, now, you know, we've got the state at 160%. That doesn't mean it's unserviceable. You know, there's national governments around the world, you know, major major economies, including the US and I think Japan, that have debt and had debt levels at 120, 150% of their GDP. It would have been gross domestic product nationally. So it's hard. There's no definitive answer, but what we flag in our report is that there's a couple of consequences of the current debt levels and the forecast debt levels. One is that because we're in an interest rate environment now that is high interest rates, the debt servicing is much higher. I mean, we're going to bite $8 billion out of $100 billion revenue. That's larger than some major government programs and services. So it's taking a greater share, which means there's less to spend on government service provision. We also allude to the fact, and there'll be a report tabled next week, that all the capital programs which they're funding through debt, what we observe over time is that they at least on average have an overrun of about 10% on average. So the debt that's already forecast is probably going to need to be 10% higher, or the government's going to have to slow down or stop its capital program. But these then become matters of policy for the government, the income and expenditure policies. I can't question the merits of, I can only talk about the consequences of. So how will we pay for it? Well, as Roberta said in the slide, there's nothing in the forward estimates to suggest when the government will start paying down debt. They're not in, so the fiscal balance at the bottom of the operating statement still looks negative in the next 4 years out, and there's no indication on the projections we've seen that it'll go positive anytime soon.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Then we're moving on to assurance from where you talked about assurance in your presentation. So someone has said we obtain independent assurance of action to close high-rated audit findings, and they're asking, how do you get comfort that actions taken to close out your external audit findings do address the finding?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So it's a two-part answer. So, you know, the reason I started this annual review was to, as I said, put a bit of pressure externally, but also model about how people should be tracking recommendations. That is a review engagement, so that's a limited assurance engagement under my Act rather than an audit. And therefore, the feature of that is we rely, pardon me, we rely on representations by the agencies that they've taken the actions. However, it's not that I'm a skeptic, but I'm a skeptic. Every year we do a couple of follow-up audits and we go in and we look at what the agencies have told us, and we try to get more evidence behind it to get comfort that they actually have taken the action that they've represented to us. And I was just talking to the team about the follow-ups we're going to do this year. And one of the key things we try to answer is whether they've taken the action or not, is the risk that we identified at the time still relevant? And do we think based on the action they've taken that they've addressed that risk? And just to round that out and extend it, I remember when I came here, there were, one of the indicators, as I said, was, action on external audit recommendations. Many agencies had a lot of stale recommendations. And I spoke to a lot of secretaries, and they were loath to stop doing any work on those. They wanted to acquit them back. And my advice to them was, if you've got a stale recommendation, first answer the question. What was the recommendation related to? Have the circumstances changed such that that is no longer a risk? Yep. And try to answer that question honestly. And if you can answer that question honestly, you've done some analysis, and therefore say, we don't think we now need to implement that recommendation. We'd be happy with that. as an audit office. We just want to see that rationalisation about not completing a recommendation as much as the rationalisation about completing them. The last thing I want is people to do a tick the box exercise and say, yeah, we've ticked off that recommendation, here's a bit of paper we've done, and really there's been no substantive change, and therefore the underlying risk hasn't been addressed.
Thank you. We have a number of questions about integrity. So I think we're really in the plenary now. So people should start putting forward their questions. And if you can just include your name, that would be great in case we don't get to you so we can follow up. But our first integrity question, Andrew, is did you know in advance about the statement from the Secretary's Board? And if not, should you have known?
So no, I didn't know in advance. It was a surprise to me. I got an email alert through the VPSC that this statement was being made. I don't meet with the VSB routinely. I think I've been in front of the VSB 2 or 3 times in my first term over 7 years. I engage more directly with individual secretaries of departments. Should I have known? Not necessarily. I mean, I have been having conversations around integrity with a number of secretaries over the last couple of years, and but I don't think that they have an obligation to tell me in advance. I think finding out about it on the day is fine. Should they would they have consulted? Should they have consulted with myself or with IBAC or OV in relation to the statement? Well, again, moot. I'm not concerned that they didn't.
The next question for you on integrity. So Jeff says he agrees we have an integrity problem, and have we at Vargo considered a performance audit of the effectiveness of Victoria's integrity system?
Well, again, I guess I could interpret the question 2 ways. The performance audit of the integrity system, I'm assuming that doesn't mean the integrity system as people would talk about it being the institutional arrangements between Vargo, Ombudsman and IBAC, which make up the integrity system. That's how that's sometimes talked about. But if you're talking about the integrity systems or frameworks that operate within departments, and then the overarching role of someone like the VPSC and now the VSB, I mean, I'm minded, absolutely I'm minded. We do touch on elements, we don't look at it through that lens holistically, but of course through our financial audit, we gauge, it's probably no secret to you, my financial auditors document on file their assessment of effectively, I'll use inverted commas, the integrity of management as it goes to the reliability of their financial reporting. They're actually bound to do that through the auditing standards. We might not call it that, but that's effectively one of the things that the financial auditors have to form a conclusion on when they're framing up their financial audit program. But yeah, I am minded now because this seems to be a persistent able and it keeps manifesting itself in a variety of areas. The one I'm looking at, obviously, and the one that is directly pertinent to yesterday is the advice on the Commonwealth Games. And what concerns me most is that we have had a series of issues, findings, whatever you want to call them, over the last 5 or 6 years here in Victoria, but also at the federal level. I can go back to the report, lessons from failure that was done after the pink bats. And, this is going back into the mid 2010s, where one of the key findings was this lack of full and frank and fearless advice from the public sector. So I am minded, and we're in the process now of looking at our forward work program to, if not look at it holistically and systematically, certainly look at aspects of integrity. I think, and maybe some of you are more familiar with this than I am, I believe IBAC are also trying to do work in this area. And I'm not sure what the progress is on that, but I think most jurisdictions are trying to do integrity self-assessments and, get a guide on integrity culture. I hope now that Victoria, after the VSB statement, picks that up and drives those kind of reviews throughout the public sector.
Well, that answer, Andrew, is a perfect segue to your next question on integrity. Most integrity measures focus on compliance. How would you assess a positive integrity culture being more than the absence of fraud and corruption?
Well, the tried answer to that is when I go in and do a performance audit, I find things are being done efficiently, effectively, and economically. There's an outcome. Well, you know, now people say, well, that's a bit trite. Okay, so what would I get below that? A lot of the stuff about integrity, it's the soft controls and the soft skills, and of course, as we know, as chairs and members of audit committees, the soft stuff is the hardest stuff to audit. Right, and I don't think anyone's really cracked it. You know, I can go back to the 2000s when a lot of the firms which were starting to market and promote, we can come in and do a culture assessment for your organisation. We can come in and do your review culture broadly and integrity culture, and I think that's succeeded to some extent, but I don't think it's been nailed. So I'm about, you know, to me, the soft stuff is, you know, the skills, the competency, the capability of the people that we employ, and the attitude of management in particular towards things like internal control. So, you know, compliance or non-compliance at the end of the day is really just an indicator of something wrong in those soft areas, I think. So I think that's where we need to focus our energy and attention. We do need to get some insights, and we do need to get some, what would be the indicia if you walked into an organisation that would speak to you of a positive culture, you know, a performance culture. You know, like, well, again, you know, reflecting on some commentary that's been made just recently by the new national head of the Crime and Corruption Commission at the federal level, opining on other events in the private sector and talking about, well, we've got to get away from the blame culture. You know, we've got to understand that people make mistakes, and it's how we respond to that, how we support people. So they're the types of things that I think we should be focused on and trying to get a handle on. I can remember going back to my days in Queensland, where it would leave me cold when, and unfortunately, you know, the Premier at the time used this as his catchphrase, but the can-do culture. You know, now can-do culture is fine if it's interpreted correctly, but if can-do culture is interpreted as avoiding process, avoiding scrutiny, just getting on and don't worry about how you do it, just do it, then that in and of itself is a problem. So how do we get a read on whether or not the organisation has this negative can-do culture or a positive can-do culture?
Okay, thank you. Moving into performance audit for a minute. Jeff has asked, has VAGO considered a performance audit of Victoria's project management performance for the big projects? The now departed Premier effectively scoffed at media questions about huge cost overruns, saying the cost will be what the cost is. I'll start off so you can then have a moment to breathe, Andrew. We are actually on, if you take the Metro Tunnel, which is one of the very big projects, we're now on our third audit on the Metro Tunnel. So we certainly have done a lot of audits on the big projects and on the project management side of that. But Andrew, did you want to add anything there?
Oh, I don't think I can add much, Megan. I think you're right. I mean, if you look at what the work we've done over the last 5 or 6 years, and even before my time, we've always looked at major capital projects because of the amounts involved and because you know, they're funded through debt. So I mean, and the consequences are therefore pretty significant if things go awry. So you're right, we will systematically, Jeff, always look at major capital projects at some stage. We've had this thematic on the Metro Tunnel. We looked a few years ago at the quality of business cases, and there's an area, if you're talking about integrity, you're talking about full and frank advice. You know, this is a serial issue for us that we find that business cases are not robust, are not complete, and to some extent, and we've said it in things like the suburban rail loop, you know, the idea didn't come through a business case, the idea came from somewhere else. And if I just reflect on that for a moment, the conversations I have with agency heads is that, and this is where public servants, I think, misunderstand their role. The government takes and makes decisions, and it's not for the public servant to question that decision or to frustrate that decision. The obligation of the public servant is to implement the policy of the government of the day. That is clear. But in doing that, the public servant is bound to provide advice. This is why we're having this issue around full and frank advice. And the debates I've had over time is the public servants say, well, this was an election commitment. So we didn't do any work on whether or not it was a good thing. We just got on and implemented it. And my advice back to them is always, if the decision was made without the benefit of advice, you're obligated as a public servant after the event to at least draw to the attention of the decision makers some of the matters that they may not have been aware of when they made that decision. Again, not to frustrate the decision, not to argue against it, but to draw out risks that may emerge or have emerged through that decision. So I think that's a much more mature approach to providing advice than some of the approaches I've seen, particularly as it goes to major capital projects.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We're heading back to debt now. So John is asking, can you describe the sentiment within government at all levels about the trajectory of debt and the absence of anything in the forward estimates to manage debt?
I don't think I can answer that in terms of the sentiment. What I focus mainly on is the consequences, and you're all aware at the state government level at least that the government has had some serious efficiency dividends and savings programs announced. So whether there's a sentiment that's positive towards the debt or negative to the debt is not really my concern. I'm really more interested in the sentiment about the need for cutting expenditure, particularly the payroll expenditure, and how agencies are going about that. You know, this is a huge challenge, particularly for the general government sector agencies and the government departments that are now having to implement pretty significant savings. And an area that I'd be interested in looking at as the Auditor-General is how agencies go about deciding what to cut, where to cut, who to cut, what's informing their decision making there.
Thanks, Andrew. So David Anderson is asking, in our organisation, efficiency in operations is assessed by the Finance Committee, while the Audit and Risk Committee focuses more on compliance, risk, etc. Should they consider joining the two committees?
I think there's good governance reasons why your Finance Committee is separated from your Audit and Risk Committee. I wouldn't, advocate one way or the other. I think there might be some benefits of having a combined committee, but there may be some disbenefits. So, if one committee is looking at one dimension and the others are looking at the other, I think it's just a matter of information sharing. Within my organisation, we've always got the last agenda item is anything being referred from another committee. So, the efficiency question may then speak to issues around governance and control and compliance, and so it may be useful information for that committee and vice versa. But I don't know that you need an organisational arrangement that combines the two.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And for all our attendees, the link for the survey is in the chat if you wanted to have a look at that. There are a number of ongoing questions about integrity, Andrew, so I might just try and combine them for you. One is around that this is the third VSB integrity statement, and would you consider assessing how each have been implemented and to what end? And is there a risk that the public service becomes politicised because of a lack of security of tenure and therefore a reluctance to provide frank and fearless advice? And questions around a whistleblower policy. How does the protection about speaking up, how is that important to integrity? So I thought you might want to do them as a group lot. Yeah.
I mean, the politicisation of the public service, you're probably aware the Ombudsman is doing an inquiry into that from a reference from Parliament. So I might leave it for the Ombudsman to publicly opine on whether there has been politicisation of the public service and to what extent that's manifested in advice to government or in government decision making. But there's a lot of literature going back and a lot of commentary going back. For those of you who go to ANZOG, it's one of the areas that's touched on pretty regularly, which is the politicisation of the public service and whether or not things like tenure or lack of security of tenure has led to politicisation. And people have different views on it, so I haven't got an informed view on that. So would I go back and look at the integrity statements and see what's done? Yeah, well, I am, because when this came out yesterday, the first thing I did was go back to the VPSC site and see what they put out on integrity. I can remember coming here in 2016, and it was one of the major policy platforms of the new government coming in is this kind of integrity reform. There was a lot of early work done at the VPSC. It's not so visible to me how that's manifesting itself now. So I am kind of keen to track this because it's a recurring issue. You could argue because it's a recurring issue, therefore whatever we've done hasn't been effective, and maybe we're not looking at the right things. So maybe we do need to look at the institutional arrangements. Clearly this is happening at the Commonwealth level. They've got a particular secretary effectively looking at the operation of the public service and how we can improve and re-professionalise the public service. There's probably a lot of useful information in that, and some steers here for Victoria as well.
Another perfect segue, Andrew. A perfect segue to Marilyn's question of, does the suggestion of a lack of frank and fearless advice suggest there is a cultural issue between the Minister's Office and the VPS, APS, perceived or real pressure?
Well, it could. Again, my mandate does not, by definition, extend to Ministers' offices. I can't include as much as I'd like to, because they're not defined to be public servants. So I'm restricted. I can only look at what public servants, and so it's harder for me to understand the role of the Minister's Office. And some of you who are working in the system would know much better than I about the pressure you feel, whether it's real or perceived, that there's a relationship between the Minister's Office and the VPS, APS. So I think I probably shouldn't comment on that, given that I don't have the full picture. But that's certainly something that's worth considering, and I'm sure that's being considered at the national level as well.
Okay, and I'm going to give you a break, Andrew, and I'll have a question, just one for Roberta. And Roberta's already answered some questions in the chat around the local government audit. But Roberta, we've had a number of questions about the experience of remote auditing. And so what have your experiences with remote auditing been, and are there any specific or opportunities or challenges that you'd like to share?
Thanks, Megan. I think the experience over the last few years of remote auditing has been quite mixed. We've been surveying our clients over the last few years to understand experience, and it's working really well in some sectors and in others it's not. What we do notice is that where an agency's technology posture is strong and their internal control environment's really mature, the process is working quite well. But I did just want to reiterate that we're not default remote in our audit space. So you might recall, for those that have been around for a while, I did a presentation in 2021 around our approach to auditing. And where we utilise the 4 modes of collaboration to determine when it's right to sort of come on site and to engage. And we've seen an uptick of on-site visits and work this year as we've come out of the pandemic for a full cycle. So we'll say it's mixed. We are again this year through our client surveys seeking your feedback and understanding your experience just to help us better determine the approach both within audit teams within VAGO and with our ASPs.
Thanks, Roberta. And Andrew, we'll head back to you. You told us in your presentation that you're really excited about your reappointment. Is there anything that you'd like to share? Is there anything you'd like to share with us about what you're really excited about over the 7 years of your term?
Well, Megan, we haven't done you much of a service. I should really have introduced Megan. I know she's had to lead this and introduced herself as the new head of performance audit, which is now Parliamentary Reports and Services. So Megan's come to us with a huge amount of experience, both in New South Wales and Victoria. And some of you may know Megan from her time here in Victoria in the 2000s and working in Premier and Cabinet and policy and social housing, and also did something similar in New South Wales. So one of the things I'm excited about, Megan, is that we've done this review of how we do performance audits, the new structures we've set up where we've aligned our PRS structures now to the parliamentary committees. And we're now embarking on a refreshed planning approach to identify topics. You know, this is why it's so great to hear directly from audit committee members, because I'm always keen to get, as I said the other day to someone, maybe it was to my external auditors, you know, one of my hallmarks of whether or not I'm effective is that most of the audits I do come from referrals, come from, you know, because people, you guys are out there, you're in the system, you would know best where we could put our effort. So I'm looking forward in this new way we go out and engage and plan and identify performance audit topics to getting a lot more referrals from Parliament and from people like yourselves. So I'm pretty excited. We're also refreshing our methodology, which I think will strengthen our topic selection, so that we are hitting, you know, so that we are doing the right things at the right time in the right way, you know, if you want to use the language of integrity in that space. And financial audit, I guess the challenges that Roberta faces, and they're probably pretty well known in the industry for those of you who work in the accounting industry, is just the changing service delivery models that are going to impact on us. You know, particularly with this, you know, the advent of data and data analytics and data science and remote working. We will be looking over the next couple of years as to our audit service delivery model and how we may then respond to the changing environment and changing technology. And then just a little over the horizon, and this is an area that I'm very keen on, is this whole area of sustainability reporting and climate related disclosures. And the you know, the standard setters are kind of indicating that they think it should be the external auditors that attest to and sign off on some of these climate-related disclosures and the broader sustainability reporting. So that would pose a huge challenge for my organisation, because we don't have experts within the organisation that could audit, if you like, that information. So we might need to reposition our organisation if it comes to fruition, if the state government determines, one, that they want to get into this space and there's already a financial reporting direction. Two, that if they want to get it done through kind of a statement, and three, whether they want the statement audited. So anyway, there's some interesting times ahead, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Andrew. And we've had a question from the health sector where entities have a joint CEO, and the person is asking about opportunities for efficiencies and synergies in relation to respective audit committees. Do you have any thoughts on that? So it's a joint CEO between two entities. Sorry, I wasn't very clear.
A joint CEO
across two entities.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting arrangement in and of itself. I don't understand the institutional arrangements, but each CEO obviously has to be has to discharge their obligations in relation to each entity separately. So I'm assuming there's no conflicts in this, or it doesn't create any particular issues for that CEO. But, you know, again, I think, you know, I talk generally about clarity of roles, responsibilities and accountability. I think my preferred model is you'd have an audit committee for each entity rather than a combined audit committee. The fact that there's a common CEO, I don't think is the deciding factor there. I think it's, you know, if you started having common systems and common staff and common processes, and, you know, they were really just two virtual entities, but they were being delivered, the services were being delivered effectively by the same people using the same systems, and I could probably see merit in having a single audit committee. But I wouldn't have thought that the CEO would be the prime determinant of a combined audit committee. Happy to, if someone wants to take that offline and talk to us about it, more than happy to engage on that. And I'm sure Roberta would have a view in the context of financial audit.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. We're almost at the end of the session, so we'll do one more question. But before we get to that, I just want to thank everyone who's already done the survey. We really appreciate you filling it in, and apparently we're already getting quite a few through, so thank you. So Andrew, this last question is from John. Has your office given consideration to the impact of generative AI on your work and on government operations generally?
Well, okay. Well, we're starting to give consideration to it, but I tell you what, the stuff I read on generative AI, you know, ChatGPT and the stuff I think that's being done Google, it produces a lot of rubbish, and once that rubbish, I was just reading a article on this the other day, once that kind of rubbish is in and learnt by the system, it can't be unlearnt. So I think we're in very early days of generative AI, these large language models in particular. It's something that we will continue to track and monitor and understand. The broader issue of artificial intelligence, absolutely, and this is where, you know, alluding to changing audit service delivery models, we've yet to see the impact of AI in, say, something like the preparation of financial reports and the audit of financial reports. But, you know, it's got to come at some stage. I mean, the progress in generative AI and the uptick in their sophistication has just, it's growing exponentially. So I would expect over the next, within my 7-year term, that we will be looking at it and trying to understand the impact of it on our work and on government.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. Andrew or Roberta, did you have any closing remarks that you'd like to make before we thank everyone for their attendance?
Look, I could just again just reiterate and thank everyone who's attended today. I hope you got value out of it. I know that we've had feedback that you like the Q&A, and so we want to make sure we're accessible. We want to do 2 a year. I know we didn't get one earlier this year through a whole range of reasons, but I'm also minded that we've had it's kind of a double-edged sword. Doing this way allows everybody to attend regionally and remotely, and I think that's a wonderful thing in terms of outreach. But I've also had feedback that people would like to come together and kind of for networking purposes, if nothing else. So we will certainly be giving thought to whether or not we do one remote and then one in person next year. So if you've already filled in the survey or you haven't, I'd like to hear from you about the idea of doing one where we all come together. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Roberta, is there anything you'd like to close on?
Just to thank everyone, thank you all for your attendance today. And if you have further interest around particularly the government's sort of position on their debt, there's a little bit of content. I was just looking in the state budget around their debt stabilisation strategy. So it sort of just provides information around the risks that they see and the plans that they've got in place currently. So I just thought I'd add that in closing, given the interest of the questions in the plenary about the debt profile of the state.
Great, thanks very much, Roberta. So I'd like to echo Roberta and Andrew's thanks. We really appreciate everyone attending and the questions and the engagement. We'll have an email out to you early next week, which will contain links to the presentations that were given today, as well as the survey. But you'll all have done the survey before you left, so you won't need that link. And we really look forward to joining you next year at our next Audit Committee Forum. So thank you very much for your time. And I know it's a bit early, but, have a lovely Christmas and a great break.